Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Tuesday, September the 14th, and today I'm joined by what's probably a familiar face at this point. This is our own reporter, Mike Cason. Mike is here today to explain a little bit about where we are in terms of medical marijuana. Now, you might be familiar earlier this year, that was something that was approved and was enacted into law that medical marijuana is legal in Alabama, but they had to form a commission to kind of work out some of the kinks and figure out exactly how this is going to work in the state. So Mike has been covering this commission in several of their meetings so far, and he's here today to give us an update on that situation. So Mike, let's first start out with talking about this commission. Now, this is the Alabama Medical, Cannabis Commission. And there's 14 members of this commission, and they've met several times so far. So first, why don't you tell us about who's on this commission and exactly what the purpose of the commission is?
Okay, thanks for having me, Ivana. As you said, there's 14 members. They were appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and other officials. There's 4 doctors on the commission. There's a pharmacist, there's a biochemist, there's a couple of lawyers, a retired judge, a couple of, I think 2 farmers and a nursery owner, a plant nursery owner. So it's a well-rounded board, and their task is big. They have to, start regulation of this industry from scratch, and it's going to be an all within Alabama, a fully intrastate industry that they've described as a seed to sale tracking program. So they've got to start out by figuring out how they're going to issue licenses for the various participants in this industry. And they're in the early stages of doing that.
Well, and you mentioned something that was interesting. You said this is all in Alabama, and they've got to figure out how to start a system from scratch. Now, when somebody might say, oh, well, what's the big deal? You just start growing it, you start selling it. What is all of the red tape? But there's several things people might not think about at first glance, Mike. And I have some of those written down, and you kind of can correct me if I'm wrong, add it in anything that I forget. But first, we've got to decide who is going to be able to grow the marijuana and get those farmers licensed. Then once that happens, there has to be a setup for the places where people can buy the medical marijuana, the dispensaries. You've got to figure out where those will be, what kind of license those places will have to have. And then there's also the physicians who will be able to prescribe medical marijuana for about 15 different conditions. You've got to train those doctors and tell the parameters of when somebody can be prescribed medical marijuana. So there's a lot of moving parts in this commission. So Mike, what is the priority to get done first?
Well, a lot of moving parts, as you said. I know the process of coming up with the rules for certifying doctors, that's already underway. The law says they'll have to have at least a 4-hour training course. And then they'll have to be refreshers, I think, every 2 years. One of the things that's gotten a lot of attention is the first thing they got to do is get plants in the ground. And so the commission will license cultivators, and I think they can license up to 12. And the legislature passed the law in May, and it does not allow anybody to be licensed before September 1, 2022. And at the last meeting, or actually at the last 2 meetings, the commission's talked about they need to get that date changed, moved up earlier, possibly in early 2022, so they can get plants in the ground, licensed cultivators, let them get plants in the ground, hopefully early next year, and then maybe have products available later next year. But the chairman of the commission said probably the most optimistic timeline would be products available next fall of 2022. But to do that, they've got to get that licensing date changed.
Well, and that's interesting. That licensing date, again, was supposed to be in the September of 2022. But you look at that date, and that doesn't mean that that's when they would be available. That would mean when people could start growing them. Right. And this is not like any plant. You don't put it in the ground and then it's ready the next day. I mean, this is a kind of a cultivating season. You have to go through the agriculture process there. So why was that September 2022 deadline created in the first place? And to change it, is that going to have to change the bill? Is that going to have to change the law and go to the governor's desk? Or what is the process for changing that date?
The process for changing will just be a bill to just make that small change in the law. There's other dates they said they might try to change. I don't think that'll be a huge hurdle. The huge hurdle was getting the 100-page bill passed. As to why they set the date when they did, I don't know. But obviously they've reconsidered, or the commission has reconsidered it. It takes 90 to 110 days to grow a crop, which it'll all be grown in greenhouses. But so if they could plant early next year, that means the plants would be mature, next spring. And I don't know how long it takes to process the plants into the products, the gel cubes or the capsules or whatever the products they'll produce. But the legislature could, they could pass a bill and change that date. I don't see that as being a huge hurdle.
Now, we should note something again, and you said this is all in Alabama. This is a interstate system, but intrastate, I guess, is the better word there. But so this means that you can't have a farmer in Georgia who is growing the crop that then is going to be used in the products. Is that right? Everything has to be done on Alabama soil.
That's right. And there's residency requirements too. And I don't know exactly. I think you have to have been in the state at least 5 years. I don't know. That may not be exactly right, but the law is also written to protect, people from out of state from swooping in here and getting licenses. So, it's written to be fully intrastate. And I think part of the reason for that is you have less likelihood if you involve multi-state. A multi-state operation would be more likely to run afoul of federal law, which, marijuana is still illegal under federal law. So I think that's one of the considerations of why they did it. We're going to do it all in state.
That's interesting. And that, that kind of makes sense as well. So why don't we look at this timeline? We know that now the people on this, again, 14-member Medical Cannabis Commission are pushing to get that timeline moved up a little bit so that in the most optimistic sense, these products could be available by maybe this time next year or late fall next year. So who is behind this timeline push? And I know we said it's optimistic, but is it realistic?
I don't know if it's realistic when they say that's the best, most optimistic viewpoint. You tend to think, well, it'll probably actually be later than that. But as far as who's behind it, the chairman of the commission is Dr. Stephen Stokes. He's a cancer doctor from Dothan who's treated a lot of patients under the Florida medical marijuana program. He and Rex Vaughn is the vice chairman. Rex Vaughn is a farmer and an official with Alpha, and they've done a lot of the talking for the commission at the meetings that I've covered, and they talked about Rex Vaughn in particular talked about the need to move that date up to so there would at least be a chance to have products available in 2022 as opposed to having to wait until 2023.
It seems like, again, there's only been 3 meetings of this commission so far, and in a pretty short period of time as well. Mike, it seems, I think, to the average person who is not in the state legislature every day like you are, that this commission seems to be really trying to get things done and moving at a pace that's quicker than a lot of other political commissions and boards that we see typically.
I think so. They split up into subcommittees and there's one subcommittee that handled the search for an executive director. That's another piece of news. They hired an executive director, and there was a subcommittee over the physician certification process. So they sort of have their marching order. The legislature, set these dates, and they have their marching orders. And they seem to be quite active in trying to get this, this massive task, trying to whittle it down some.
We've got some comments that I think are interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Some people say, well, maybe the long timeline is for the politicians who oppose this law to have some time to kind of fight it before things actually get moving on the ground. But is that realistic for opposition to be fighting this after it has already been signed into law? Is there anything for these politicians who oppose the law to really do at this point?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it passed by a 2-1 margin, and unless there's things I don't know, that I think the big fight on that is over with. I think it's going to happen, and it's not like Alabama's jumping out there. There's 30, 36, 37 other states have already done this. So, no, I don't think the long timeline was intended to build up opposition and possibly stop this. And as I said, I don't think changing these dates is going to be a big hurdle. I think it's going to be, unless people introduce other issues. But I don't think that's going to be a major concern.
And what's also interesting is there wasn't as much opposition to this bill when it was passed as maybe a lot of people expected. I know it's been a couple months now, but do you remember kind of the numbers on that law or how many people were opposed to it?
It passed by it had passed the Senate twice before this year, and it never passed the House. And that's where people thought, well, it's still going to be challenging to get it through the House. But I don't know, the more people, became educated about it, the opposition to it just sort of subsided, and it passed. I think it was, like I said, I think it was like a 2-1 margin in the House. And there were former law enforcement. There's a lot of former cops in the House, and they all supported it, as far as I remember. I remember Alan Farley, who's a state rep from Jefferson County, who was a longtime official with the Sheriff's Department in Jefferson County. He spoke forcefully for it, saying that, he had seen, I can't remember if it was a family member he had seen suffer in later stages of cancer, and he wished that she had been able to use medical cannabis. You heard a lot of those kind of stories throughout the time the bill was being considered.
I know, and you wrote a lot of those, Mike, and included a lot of those in your coverage, and a lot of them were heartbreaking. Questions that I've gotten here as well is about how the consumer will be able to use this law and be able to use the medical marijuana. So we know that this is going to be prescription only. Again, there's about 15 or so conditions that the law says can receive a prescription for medical marijuana. We know doctors are going to have to go to a certain training course to give them parameters on how and when to prescribe. But will the average consumer be able to have what we've seen in other states, a card that allows them to pick up their medication from these dispensaries? Or what exactly are we looking at there? Or do we even know yet?
Yes, you'll have a card. Patients will go to their doctor. They have to be a doctor certified to. It is not a prescription. It's called a recommendation. I mean, since marijuana is still an FDA controlled substance, it won't be called a prescription, and pharmacists won't prescribe, won't fill it won't come from pharmacists. It'll be at licensed dispensaries. And yes, there'll be medical cannabis cards. If you're a patient and you go to a doctor and you get certified for one of the conditions, you'll be issued a medical cannabis card. It'll have your photo on it, and your name will go in a registry. And the registry will say what your condition is, what your daily dosage is, and I think the type of medical cannabis product that your doctor recommended. And there's limitations on how much you can have in possession at one time. I think it's up to 70 daily doses that you can have at one time, a patient can have. And there's limitations on the amount of THC in these products.
It's interesting that you kind of make that a line between a prescription and a recommendation. So this is technically a recommendation. That's interesting. And also you point out that you can't just go into your local Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid and fill this. This is going to have to come from a dispensary that is not part of a pharmaceutical chain, that is not just the one on your local corner. Again, that Walgreens, CVS that you might get all of your other prescriptions. So I think that's something interesting. And that's something that, at least to my knowledge, we haven't figured out exactly how that's going to work yet.
The dispensaries will be licensed. There's a limit on how many there are. I don't know what that number is, but in every city and county will have to authorize it. In other words, if you're Jefferson County wants to have dispensaries, the county commission will have to pass a resolution allowing it. So if there's cities or counties that want to keep it out, they can do so.
That's an interesting point too. Questions here. This is a good one, and I'm not sure that we know the answer yet, Mike, but worth asking. This is from Anthony, and he's saying, who gets to run a dispensary? What are the prerequisites there? What are the requirements?
The dispensaries will be licensed by the Cannabis Commission, like the cultivators we were talking about. I don't know exactly what the qualifications for that are. I think some of that's spelled out in the law. I think that there's going to be that residency requirement that you will have had to been in Alabama for a certain amount of time. But as far as the specifics on who can get licenses, I don't know that. I'm sorry, but that may be something the commission still got to develop those rules.
And there's another question interesting about the card and giving up different rights. I'm assuming this person means to privacy. So you get this card once you get your recommendation and once you decide that you are going to pick up your recommendation of that different medical marijuana product. Again, whether it's the gel capsules or whichever method that you choose. You mentioned then that the information on your card goes into a registry. Give us a little bit more about what you know about that registry.
Well, the registry will be, I guess one of the questions people have is the confidentiality, and the law, says it will be confidential. The law specifies exactly who can access that information. Obviously, the certifying physicians will have to access it, and it's going to be restricted. And the law is written. The intent, anyway, is that your people won't be able to look you up online to see if you're using medical marijuana. So that's that information in that registry is supposed to be protected.
When you say protected, does that mean that it is available just to, say, law enforcement? Say you get pulled over and you are found to have this product in your car, they can look it up and see that you do have a recommendation? Or when you say protected, exactly who has access to that information?
Law enforcement would have access, and I'm sorry, I don't have the full. It spells out exactly who has access, and it's limited to that. But the law enforcement, pharmacists may have access to it. I'm not sure about that. But the certifying doctors would have access because, if a patient goes to a doctor, they need to know whether this person's already receiving medical cannabis. So I think would pretty much be restricted to those groups, law enforcement, and whoever in the medical community needs that information.
Now, Mike, when is the next meeting of this commission? When do we expect to learn more about the next steps?
The next meeting's in October, and that'll be, that's the next meeting. The other thing we didn't mention was that at this last meeting, they hired John McMillan as the executive director, who's going to oversee this agency, and they'll be hiring employees and so forth. But Mr. McMillan didn't formally accept the job, but he indicated he intends to. Now, he is the state treasurer, just elected in 2018. So his intent, he said he would resign. If all goes as planned, he'll resign as state treasurer and take over this job. He's got a lot of experience in state government. He was served 2 terms as Agriculture and Industries Commissioner before being elected state treasurer.
And then another good question here that I just got in from Morgan, and she says, will this have a effect on somebody's ability to either apply for, or if they already have a concealed carry license? Other people, again, kind of asking similar questions about purchasing firearms, if this license or this card, rather, to have the medical marijuana recommendation will affect other licenses like that.
That's a good question. I don't think there's anything in the law that says if you have a medical cannabis card, it affects your, ability to have a concealed carry permit. No, I don't think there's any connection there.
Also, a question about what the difference in this law, this medical marijuana law, is versus, say, the hemp law that we saw several years ago and several other laws that have been introduced recently.
Well, the hemp law passed a few years ago allowed farmers to grow industrial hemp, which is used to one of the main things it's used for is to make CBD oil, which is legal now. CBD oil made from hemp is now legal in Alabama, and the hemp is another form of the cannabis plant, but it just has much less THC. So those CBD oil products have much lower levels of THC than these medical marijuana products will have. But that's the difference. Hemp, the state, licenses and regulates hemp farmers too, and has only been doing that a couple of years. So that's fairly new industry too. But those hemp crops are tested to make sure they don't have too much THC in them, and that's the difference. The THC amount.
Mike, thank you so much for all of the information that you have given us. We're going to link some of your coverage here as well for people who want to get a little bit more in detail about the conditions that this medical marijuana law will affect and more. So I know that you will give us an update next month at that next meeting.
Thanks, Ivana. Thank you for having me.
Mike, thanks again, everybody watching. Thank you so much. Be sure to join us at 11 a.m. tomorrow for our latest COVID-19 town hall. We will speak to Dr. Michael Sagg of UAB and Dr. Scott Harris of the Alabama Department of Public Health. We will take your COVID questions, so send them here in the comments. You can also email them to ihryNkiw@al.com or vaccines, VACCINES @al.com. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.